Coming to you from the Windy City. Welcome to Let's Talk Shop, a podcast about all things cloud and enterprise tech. Listen to insights and guest interviews with IT thought leaders and professionals. Now, here's your host, Elias Khnaser.
Today, I have a really special guest. He is a fellow Pluralsight author. He's currently working for Google, and the topic that we have is a really interesting and maybe controversial topic a little bit around distributed cloud and multi-cloud. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Richard Seroter to the show. Well, Richard, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, I'm really happy you invited me. Thanks for that. Looking forward to this. Should be fun.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So you're working for Google. What are you doing for Google?
I mean, I'd say as little as possible, but then my boss will hear this and I'll get in trouble. So I'm a director of product management, outbound product management at Google. So, product management's the fun part of figuring out what you build and how to make sure people understand it. So I lead a fun team of folks who kind of help, especially the outbound part, to help people really understand the products a little better, talk to analysts, talk to press, talk to customers a ton, and then feed that back into product strategy, make sure we build the right thing.
Nice.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
So I heard from a few folks that you're in love with distributed cloud, especially the term distributed cloud.
Oh gosh, I think you heard wrong, but look, I think it's an interesting definition of things, right? I mean, a lot of people just get tired of any new term because immediately everything gets washed with that term, right? Everything's DevOps all of a sudden, everything's secure software supply chains now, everything's cloud washed, container washed, Kubernetes. So distributed cloud, I think everyone is excused if they roll their eyes, go, what the heck is this? But I think this idea of, and again, you know this well from your own experience, this idea of saying, hey, do I have sort of single sourced managed experiences on cloud, on-prem, at the edge, at a regional POP, at sort of things, and saying this isn't just DIY, right? Because we could do this for years, right? You could set up an OpenStack here and a public cloud here and some edge kit over here, and that's still fine. And frankly, that's what everybody's doing. But this idea of saying, all right, well, maybe I am starting to think about how do I centralize the control plane of those things and maybe don't have 9 different stacks and everything's integrated weird. And maybe there is a managed experience, even on the edge experience or on the on-prem experience. I'm not running this whole thing. So that model makes sense to me. I don't see a ton of people doing it yet because I think it is still a bit of a fragmented space from vendors, from, how do you integrate with this? Do people get nervous about single sourcing this entire kind of conglomerate cloud? But I get the concept of it. I think there's something there. I'm actually interested in your take on, where do you sit on the amazing skeptic to I'm wearing the branded t-shirt?
So, I mean, that's a fair point. So, I mean, I was at Gartner when this whole distributed cloud started to get a definition. I like the definition. I think it merits its own definition. So from that perspective, I like it. My challenge with distributed cloud and a lot of the things you touched on, the challenge always for the private implementations of these cloud has always been an operational challenge. It's been the teams incapable of running on-prem or at the edge the way that a Google or an AWS or an Azure can run this infrastructure on your behalf or in the cloud. So it's operating these models. So whether it was OpenStack, to your point, I mean, OpenStack, for all intents and purposes, OpenStack was not a success, right? You don't hear of, all of these deployments of OpenStack. Even Walmart, if I'm not mistaken, took a stab at this and wasn't really hugely successful with operating OpenStack. And I think they went over to Azure at one point. So the problem with these is the operational model of it. And I agree with you. I mean, there's a lot of interest in distributed cloud. There's not enough implementations of distributed cloud. I think there's interesting use cases, especially for exit strategies, or at least being able to check the box for an exit strategy that should something happen in the public cloud, I can, at least for some services, move off of cloud and maintain some level of experience. I like it. I think there's a lot of maturity that needs to happen. There's a lot of training that needs to happen. And I'm not convinced. I'm still not convinced that on-prem this will be successful, but it's definitely a hot topic.
Yeah, look, I think there's certain use cases where this will be great. And I'm sure, and there's plenty of folks. My friend Josh McKenty from the Pivotal Days was one of the creators of OpenStack. And I think he'd tell you, look, it found a niche in telcos in certain places.
Sure.
So for what it was, now, given the hype, it did not succeed. I mean, given where the hype was, but it found a home. And I think distributed cloud will find a home in certain use cases. I think to your point, it's that operational aspect of on-prem where I just don't believe always, I mean, for most organizations, dropping a fully hyper-converged kit has ever proven to be wildly successful. And then for others, it just, because it doesn't have the flexibility that on-prem ops team wants to do, say, hey, we want to use this storage provider. Hey, our network is different, so we don't want to play with that, whatever you've set up. Hey, our stack, hey, we need to own the operating system. And all of a sudden you have so many compromises that you end up with, again, this sort of Franken platform, which now defeats the purpose of a fully managed experience, and you're back to square one. So I know the promise of it, but I don't know if there's ever been a wildly successful private cloud. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think if I talk to my Gartner friends now, they'll say that's why they don't even do an MQ around it, because arguably there's no such thing. There's just different versions of virtualized automation. That's different.
Well, virtualized automation, I agree with. So I definitely agree that private clouds failed, in my opinion, at least. So virtualized automation definitely works. And to your point, I mean, you brought up Pivotal. There's also OpenShift. Like even those two, let's call them private PaaS solutions, which is another form of private cloud. Mm-hmm. They've been successful, but did they go like mainstream? Do you have enough implementations of them? Again, it's sketchy. There's a niche, but not enough adoption, and I still think that it's the operating model. Now we're starting to again rally around this concept of a platform ops and trying to address some of these challenges with platform ops. Before that, it was DevOps, and there's SRE. So there's all of these things, but on-prem, I just feel like the cloud model is always going to be limited or not succeed. I think a highly virtualized, highly automated environment is probably the limit of what we would be able to do there.
Yeah, and people find satisfaction with what they can do today, which is great. Again, it's not to say private clouds haven't been successful because people are terrible. It's because you're never going to mimic the public cloud on premises. You can't. There's just from a scale perspective or an on-demand perspective or the managed perspective, and trying to, for most people, some organizations, it actually does make sense given the business they run, and it's a small pool. There's probably 20 companies in the world that truly need it, but nonetheless, like for those, it makes sense. And for others, they've done some great internal automation. They have some great self-service. I've seen some really cool on-prem infrastructure. So it's not saying people can't do it, but this sort of myth that I can actually do Amazon, Azure, Google, Oracle, IBM, whomever, fully on-prem, it's never true. It's never going to be true. So it's a lie we tell ourselves, and I think it's a lie buyers tell themselves to think that, oh, I don't need to go to this other foreign public cloud because I can bring it to me. It never will truly be the same.
Well, and then there's the question of why. Why do you even need to have that type of an implementation? On-prem, what is the value? Like, again, what are you trying to solve for? And I think that's what usually gets missed when folks are, well, I want to put a private cloud in place. The why is, I think, always usually missing, because again, the cloud is solving for a lot of different things, and there's a lot of new use cases that are coming. There's an enormous amount of data that even if you wanted to store on-prem would be incredibly difficult. There's the edge and all of the sensors and IoT and processing things in real time. Mm-hmm. So the idea that you can mimic this stuff on-prem, again, I've never seen it successful. There's
Yeah, and I don't know how many people really in their heart believe they're trying to do that. I think it's look, if a company starts today, not starting in the cloud feels a bit foolish. Like, why would you not do SaaS for your business operations? Why wouldn't you use Google Workspace? Why wouldn't you use Workday? Of course, right? Why in the world would I install SharePoint on-prem if I started a company today? I think that's insane, right? So, but that's not most companies. Most companies say, hey, look, I think we're the place. I'd love your take. I think public cloud could probably run 90-something% of any enterprise at this point. Like if you just said, could you run at this point, even my mainframe, my Oracle databases, my SAP, I think cloud is now capable, and it wasn't 10 years ago.
That's right.
So, but now it's capable of running 90-95% of everything in the enterprise. The hard part is still getting it there. And that takes a while. So if I'm a pragmatic CIO, I might go, hey, if I had a magic wand, of course I would all be over there tomorrow. It's a 5 to 10 year journey, and I don't want on-prem to suck for the next 5 or 10 years. Can't I make this more automated, more security conscious, more speed oriented? And that's where I think you start going down this path, because you can't just move. There's unlimited time and people and budget. So I can't move things that quickly. If I move, look, 5 apps a month, most organizations have thousands of applications. So I think that's what I see is you can't just move the web app, right? You're moving the TIBCO, you're moving the databases, you're moving the logging infrastructure. It just takes time. And so do I want this sort of have and have nots world for 5 or 10 years? I don't think so. So you're trying to bring them closer together, and that is admirable. It's just tough.
Yeah. Well, and then you have the problem, and this is more prevalent probably outside of North America, which is not every geography has a region, and then you start to go into problems with data sovereignty and privacy and all sorts of things that are giving the need for these types of distributed clouds or private clouds. And the other thing that you add on top of all of that is sometimes with these markets, when you're trying to deploy, especially when you get into like the financials, the regulators are basically saying, give me an exit strategy. Now that exit strategy doesn't ever mean that you're ever going to implement it, but they want to know that there is some form of an exit strategy. And this notion of distributed cloud at least promises an exit for some of the services. Because again, I think even the most mature of these distributed cloud offering, and we'll talk about those in a second, it's not a one-to-one, right? So not all the services that are offered in the public cloud are offered on these solutions, which complicates things a little bit more.
Right. And it's not giving you a multi-cloud answer. So if my exit is I literally need to leave this provider, distributed cloud's not helping me there. I'm just bouncing between modalities of a given provider, which again is still powerful, but that's not saying I need to exit this provider. That might be I'm exiting this region for compliance reasons. I might be those sort of, as you say. So that's why when I say, cloud today, like Google Cloud, I think could run 95% of any company's workloads. That's technologically. To your point, there might be a company who's sitting in a certain region where it's 300 milliseconds of latency. I can't tolerate that.
Yep.
Cool. Then you need a local zone. You need other stuff. Makes tons of sense. There's going to be other reasons where it's not just the technology getting in the way. It's people, it's geography, it's certifications, it's whatever it is. And that, again, that makes sense. That's why you need more options than just, hey, we're just going to shove everything into US East 1, because that's not practical.
No, and that's proven that it could be very problematic too.
Right. It's also a terrible idea.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Google Anthos. So the difference between the implementation of Google for this distributed cloud model and that of like an AWS or an Azure. With AWS and Azure, to a large degree, it's either a tethered or untethered, or sometimes it's a mixture of both. But you have a like-for-like experience, so a very similar management console. Some of the services that are available in the public cloud are available on these solutions. Whereas it feels like Google Anthos kind of took a different approach, where it allows you to do more of Kubernetes orchestration. So it's focused mostly on the containers, but it doesn't have the ability to like have the same services that you have in Google Cloud. Like you don't have Spanner running on Anthos, as far as I know. So why do you feel like Google took this different approach to this model?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that. So first, there's as you say, when Outposts and Azure Stack came out, here's this hyperconverged hardware kit that has kind of a shadow of the public cloud. Like, look, it's still a fraction of the number of services. There's plenty of caveats and small print. And so even if you do think, hey, I'm running my private cloud that looks like Azure, you're not. I mean, you're running a few things, sure. You've got some portability because of common APIs, which again is helpful. But it's not the same experience, but it is potentially an on-ramp or gives me some parity. And so I think what we did with Anthos was interesting, because we did zag when everyone was zigging and saying, well, do we just shove hardware into your data center? And there's use cases for that. And that's our Google distributed cloud, which we'll talk about. But when we started with Anthos and said, is it really about a more modern application stack? Saying, hey, should I have a Kubernetes-based application platform that I can put on any infrastructure? That's where the software value comes in, because I can't run Azure Stack on Oracle. I can't run Azure Stack on AWS. It is still just a satellite of that public cloud. Versus Google says, okay, with Anthos, I can take this Kubernetes-based app stack. I can run it on bare metal or vSphere or Amazon or Azure, all GA. And I'm going to keep a tether back to Google Clouds for, if I want to, for logs and monitor metric info that I don't feel like storing on-prem or in that other cloud. I want to do centralized management, the whole mythical single pane of glass stuff, which actually does work. I want to have a single connectivity broker. So like right now, I can do CI/CD to every single cloud via the Google Cloud Console. It's kind of amazing. Like I can push my app and promote it from Amazon to Azure to Google Cloud, all from us because we maintain a tether to those environments. They have some pretty cool tech there. So I think that software-based approach was interesting because you and I know hardware is a life commitment, right? If I'm wheeling racks into my data center, there's no try before you buy. There's no, hey, can I go run this in, again, I have a lot of infrastructure. My problem is not that. My problem isn't capital. My problem is sometimes it's underutilized infrastructure. So why am I shoving more in there? Maybe I want to put software on that and turn that vSphere environment, which has been an underperforming hypervisor setup, to an application stack on top. All right, well now maybe it's a little more developer friendly, a little more velocity centric. And so when I look at Anthos now, there's three types of customers, right? There's I'm replacing my Gen 1 platform, folks who made a bet years ago on Pivotal tech, OpenShift stuff, Docker stuff, Mesos stuff, and saying that was all great. That got me a good step forward. I learned containerization, CI/CD, awesome stuff. I am better as an org because I made that bet. And now I look forward going, all right, do I want something a little tighter, a little more composable, a little more open source friendly, frankly, a little more kind of future focused? All right, I'm going to replace my Gen 1 with Gen 2. It's kind of the biggest pool of Anthos customers today. But then the second one is, hey, I'm already in this cloud of Google and I like it. I'd love to bring GKE with me because I'm also doing some workloads over in Azure, doing some stuff on-prem. So I'm stretching out from my primary cloud, a lot of those as well. But then that third one, which is kind of exciting to me, is people just with new use cases. Like I'm not going to stick Pivotal Cloud Foundry in 10,000 fast food restaurants. I'm not going to stick this in a bunch of edge locations. I'm not going to, that's a brand new use case, right? I'm not going to do, especially from licensing perspective, that kind of architecture. Those platforms were never built for that. They were built for fairly monolithic setups in a few locations, not hyper distributed infrastructure. And so Anthos and being software-based, I can run an Anthos GKE cluster on a single node, 2 vCPUs, 4 gigs of RAM. Like, oh my gosh, I can run a GKE cluster on that infrastructure anywhere. That opens up some doors. So being software-based was interesting. The goal was not to duplicate Google Cloud and put Spanner and BigQuery and PubSub and all these things somewhere else where, frankly, they're not going to be as good. You should use the public cloud. But this gives you an extension to the public cloud that's compute-oriented, where it can sit close to your data. Because for most of these companies, they're not coming to us saying we need a better database right now. They do. They should use the cloud ones. But if they're already on-prem, that data is locked into where it is. So do I need to give them a new data service on-prem, or can I just say, here's a better compute environment, which you do need, access that existing data sitting where it is, maybe start to modernize from Oracle to Postgres or whatever you're doing, but really focus on compute, focus on CI/CD, focus on security, delivery. That's the bet we're making. Now, the new bet that we announced back at Next in 2021 was Google Distributed Cloud. And that said, all right, should we use Anthos as the control plane? Because we like this idea of kind of a Kubernetes API. It's easy to bring third-party extensions into that. There's no proprietary cloud API for us, right? It's a Kubernetes API. So if you have a great load balancer you like from a third party, you have a great IoT device for ingestion and that works with K8s, just works. It's great. So let me take that same API. Let me now put that into fully Google managed hardware where I can do two variations. I could do a kind of an edge still connected version, great for network function virtualization stuff with telcos, might be great for retail edge, all those things, or kind of a disconnected, more sovereign kind of focused infrastructure, still the same control plane, but air gapped. And so all of a sudden now I'm using the same stack, but now in this more distributed world, it can be in public, can be in private, can be software, can be hardware, same kind of management layer, same skill set. So I actually like that we've grown up from software to infrastructure versus starting with infrastructure and then trying to backport into software. I think it gave our customers an easier way to get into this without signing over their firstborn or having to make this giant commitment into private cloud.
I like it. I mean, look, my thinking on this has evolved as well. I mean, you gave the example of restaurants. I think Chick-fil-A has done a really good job with putting these edge locations with a lot of a lot of interesting tech within each of their restaurants. Now, there is, so my challenge is there are some services that would be cool to have, as part of Anthos. For example, the functions as a service capability, or maybe even PubSub, the object storage. Now, I do like the integration piece. I think that solves for a lot of these potentially. But that always felt like the missing piece for me. But I will give you that. I also subscribe to the idea that, look, whatever's running in the public cloud, run it in the public cloud. Don't try to move it or mimic it on premises or at the edge. So I can appreciate that for sure. The challenge for that, though, then becomes, especially for financials, where the regulators are asking for an exit strategy, it becomes difficult for them to use any kind of PaaS service, because then the PaaS service sort of locks you in, unless, and I think Microsoft is doing a little bit of that, where a lot of these PaaS services are starting to become Kubernetes based anyway, and they're able to port them out of Azure, for example, onto an Azure stack. So is Google considering something like, or are you even doing something like this?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we do now. So, I mean, I can use, there's like 80, 90 things in the Google Cloud Marketplace that deploy to an Anthos cluster, or bring your Confluent Kafka, bring your Mongo. It's a Kubernetes operator. And so that's actually where Pivotal, if I go back years ago when I was working there, Bosch and this model for provisioning infrastructure was powerful, but we'd have to work with partners to build like Bosch integrations. And they would have to build a certain thing of, how do I actually deploy my VMs that run my workload? And it was a special investment you made just for us. It's a big lift at some point, not only building it, but maintaining it, versus here, if it's, hey, bring your Kubernetes operator. I'm not asking our friends at Mongo to do anything different than they're doing already, or Confluent or Redis or Elastic or any of these companies. So that's actually the powerful thing for a company making this bet on-prem and picking a platform like this, is go ahead and use kind of our distribution of Kubernetes with our fleet management and our cloud connectivity and all that stuff. But hey, if you want to bring in your favorite Postgres instance, rock on. And then you want to keep using that in the cloud or do whatever. I think that's a super powerful way to not necessarily be stuck to a bunch of, especially on-prem, cloud provided application services when maybe you haven't made that bet yet. And you're not all in on that proprietary service in the cloud. Look, you should use the proprietary services in the cloud. They're awesome. And we have Cloud Run and some of that functional experience you can do with Anthos today. But I get when people say, hey, look, I just want to keep using the same Postgres everywhere. I want to use the same message bus everywhere, because I haven't made a full-on total bet to one cloud. And so instead of me jamming more proprietary stuff into that stack and making it maybe feel a little bit like, I either have to be all in or out. Nope, you should be all in on the compute stack and containerization and CI/CD stuff. But then you should be bringing and connecting to the things you've already invested in until you make the next leap.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I mean, if they subscribe to that type of a mentality, to be honest with you, they don't even need a multi-cloud strategy. I mean, they can pretty much deploy GKE without having any of the cloud providers. You can go to a colo provider at that point and just deploy it on bare metal. They have just as many of the same regions and geographical footprint as the cloud providers. And I would at that point make the argument of, why even have another abstraction layer? Why pay anyone an additional fee? Go to an Equinix or some kind of a colo provider and just use they already have compute as a service, so you can deploy on top of that, or your bare metal, and bada bing bada boom, you have the footprint, the scalability, and you have the software stack, and you're pretty much off to the races. Are you seeing some of that, or is it mostly multi-cloud, as in we're going to take Anthos or GKE and deploy them on AWS and on Azure or Oracle, IBM for that matter?
Yeah, it's often a compute proximity play. Like, look, I think we're moving away from, you all said this, or you all used to say this, a Gartner thing. It's not about data centers anymore. It's about centers of data. I like that quote because it's a smart idea. And so look, if you have your data lake on S3, there's a reason that's why we put BigQuery Omni together, where I can run BigQuery against my S3 data lake. My job isn't I want to get you out of S3, let's be honest, but you're gonna stay there. How about I bring the compute to you? So Anthos is really a play to bring the compute to wherever your data and services are. So people put Anthos on AWS because they're already invested in Dynamo. They're already invested in SQS architecture, but hey, they're also kind of have some gravity to Google Cloud and some of the data, and say, I'd like one control plane. I want to have one version of Kubernetes I'm upgrading, because EKS runs a different version than GKE, than AKS, and my on-prem. And I want one set of tools, one sort of consistency when I apply Istio, that they all work because it's all the same version. I don't want to be doing pattern matching and upgrades across 9 flavors of everything. So I want one GKE experience. I'm going to still tap into all the first-party services in Azure or Amazon or whatever, but I want to do it from a common compute layer. That happens a lot. Now, I just talked to a game company last week that already had a big Amazon investment. So that's where they do the testing, like the test builds of their games, but production's GKE and Google Cloud. So all of a sudden when I'm showing them, and now I can do CD between continuous delivery between Amazon and Google Cloud, and putting even Anthos on all of them gives me consistency. Like, oh, that makes sense. Because look, every single game company I've talked to, they run in every cloud because that's how we're making them do it. Arguably, like Rick, Stadia gives you benefits to running Google Cloud. Xbox wants you in Azure. Yep. You have Luna stuff with Amazon. So a lot of these companies are just strategically multi-cloud. And so app by app, game by game, workload by workload. Others are doing some of the failover thing. I don't know how much you see that. I don't love that pattern because, you know, any cloud blip is minutes or hours for the most part at the worst. And so by the time you cut over your failover, like that's a really expensive architecture. So I don't love multi-cloud for failover. That's a lot of complexity and cost. I don't mind it for kind of workload by workload because there's going to be reasons that different departments and teams and skills pick one over the other. That makes sense to me. And if you want to at least harmonize the base from a policy management perspective, API management, I get picking like a GKE fabric, but then I don't like doing lowest common denominator stuff where, all right, I'm still going to bring my own self-managed database to every cloud. Like, stop that. Like, use the managed SQL, use RDS, use Cloud SQL, use Azure SQL. It's going to save you so much more energy and time than running your own giant database instance. So, but can you at least harmonize the compute and sort of maybe in the deployment patterns with containers and then still tap into the novel stuff? I think that's a decent pattern. I see it a fair bit now where you've got lock-in at the most strategic layers and you're not necessarily stuck on a whole stack.
Yeah, you bring some really good points. So I think you make a really good point early on, which is folks are under the impression that just because they're running Kubernetes, that means they can just pick up and go from AWS to Azure to Google with ease. And honestly, when you're doing it, it's not that easy. You have to reconcile a bunch of things. So putting something like, you know, a GKE on top, you know, and standardizing that makes a lot of sense to me. I agree with you. Multi-cloud for failover, it sounds good. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't recommend it to customers. I mean, again, it has a lot of dependencies. It also lowers you to the lowest common denominator, which means if you're using multi-cloud for failover, that means you're really at an infrastructure level at that point. So containers, VMs, and data, because that's the only thing you can really move. And that prohibits you from going up the stack. And customers are starting to ease up on the fear of lock-in that was, you know, around earlier by understanding that, hey, lock-in is not necessarily bad. You're already locked in today. On premises is what I tell customers. Right. You know, pick whoever you want, whether it's VMware, Microsoft, Oracle. You're already locked in. You can always get out of a lock-in. It's just time-consuming, operationally challenging, and it can be costly. Right. So I agree with that, and I also like that. You know, the idea of multi-cloud is you're going to have different workloads on different clouds. I think that we're seeing a decent amount of customers have arrived at the conclusion that, you know, sometimes they want best of breed. Like, you know, there was a ton of customers that liked, for example, Amazon Redshift for its data warehousing capabilities, but they preferred Azure Power BI for its visualization capabilities. Sure. So their ability to do some of that is powerful. We're also seeing, and that's something I'd love to ask you about. I don't know if you know, but Microsoft's doing a good job with multi-cloud in that they have this partnership now with Oracle, where it's a co-opetition. I mean, Oracle has OCI, so they are competing with Google and the others on that. But they also have this idea where they're interconnecting Microsoft and Oracle regions to give you that low latency, high bandwidth approach, where you could put Oracle databases, Exadata, etc., on Oracle, and put everything else potentially on Azure, and you sort of have the best of both worlds approach. Is there something with Google that's going down the same path?
Yeah, nothing I can talk about that is cooking, but I think that's a decent pattern. I mean, look, the most prohibitive thing, I don't know, to me, multi-cloud is both harder than everybody thinks and easier than everybody thinks.
I agree.
Like, it's both. Like, I think it's harder because, as you mentioned, Like the hard part isn't even the compute. The hard part's identity management,
Yeah.
account management,
Integration.
hierarchies,
Yeah.
billing, frankly, bandwidth. Like
Yeah.
you can't build a multi-cloud system that spans clouds because you're going to get eaten alive on bandwidth costs. It just
Right.
is the nature of the beast right now. So on one hand, that's harder. Now, on the other hand, it's easier because open APIs are a real thing. Like I can use RDS and frankly, even Spanner today with a Postgres API, make 0 code changes moving an app between clouds. Today, I can do that. Now, every messaging engine doesn't do that, and the AI system. So clearly, there's still proprietary APIs for some of those things. But I think you're seeing an open API model, which is interesting, right? Mongo is fairly common. Database, messaging, Kafka APIs. You have a number of things across clouds that have simplified that a bit. And if I use a good programming language, Java Spring Framework's pretty easy to just swap out connections between this database and this database. Or I can talk to, Google Pub Sub or Amazon SQS, make it change completely with a no code changes with Spring. So I can also build apps that still take advantage of first-party services. But as you say, everything is lock-in. Your choice of Java is lock-in. Your choice of NetApp is lock-in. Your Windows lock-in. Your marriage is lock-in. Like everything's lock-in. It's just a matter of like, what's my switching cost? And if I'm getting value from the thing, who cares? Like, yeah, I guess I'm locked into my house, but I like it here. What do I care? So I get that there's a caution. I talked to a company this week and I presented to them and said, hey, look, all things considered, I really like all of it. Like a multi-cloud isn't my favorite thing. Google Cloud would love if you just pick us. Like I'm not trying to make Azure better. I'm making it tolerable while you're there so that you come over here later. But she said, hey, look, I hear it. I'm never going to just pick one. Like I am always going to continue to spread workloads, both for risk reasons, functionality reasons, and others. So the one who plays nicest in the sandbox is the one we're going to favor because I'm always going to make all of these different choices. So it doesn't matter if you academically have an argument that you should run all your workloads with me because we're the best. Doesn't matter. That's not going to be the reason.
I agree.
How you embrace hybrid stuff, how you make certain things portable. I think our bet on containers is a huge one because we've made compute at least much more portable than it ever was. I can run the exact same app in our FAS platform, our container orchestrator, and our VMs at the same time. Like that's amazing. No cloud's doing that. So I think our bet on containers has made that easier, but I'm super pragmatic. It doesn't matter if I think we have the best cloud. Our customers are able to now make their best choice.
I agree. And I think that's the right approach. That's the right mindset. That was the messaging that, again, when I was at Gartner, the advice that I would give cloud providers. It's funny, about 5 years ago, I gave this advice, and I won't say to who, but I basically advised a cloud provider that they need to become frenemies with their other providers. And essentially, you continue to compete. Nobody wants you to stop competing because at the end of the day, customers will win when cloud providers are competing. But at the same time, some level of integration is crucial. You bring up identity. There's a lot of other areas where they need to be able to integrate better together. I think the pandemic highlighted the importance of a need for cloud providers to integrate or to talk to each other at some level, right? So early days of the pandemic, when everyone's hair was on fire. I mean, there were customers that wanted to spin up 5,000 or 10,000 VMs just to be able to support work from home, right? And that's difficult to go to a Google and say, you know what, in this region, I'm going to spin up 5,000 VMs. Like, yes, supposedly it's unlimited capacity, but we both know there's limits to everything, and it's not really fair to make these types of requests. But it does highlight the importance of, should something large happen in the world, maybe one of the cloud providers comes under some kind of a cyber attack, a DDoS attack, anything, they should be able to lean on the other cloud providers for capacity, for support, for stuff like that, where they can help one another. Kind of like what goes on in the airline industry, where I've been stuck I've never been able to leave SFO, never, ever, ever on time. It's either a canceled flight or very delayed. And oftentimes I'll be on United and they'll be like, well, our flight got canceled, but they'll put me on an American flight. These types of things, I think the cloud providers need to at some point discuss or begin having these conversations. As the world changes, I think that becomes crucial.
I mean, it's funny. I think that's the ecosystem that's popped up outside of the clouds, because I don't know of any shadowy meetings happening right now between all the grand poobahs of the clouds meeting in some dark smoke-filled room, figuring out like a multi-cloud standard. That's not happening to my knowledge. But when you look at certain things, like, look, this week we added support or last week for GKE to just authenticate cluster permissions with any OpenID Connect provider. That means I could use Azure Active Directory.
Yep.
And I could say, look, my bet on identity is AD. And I'm going to probably anchor it maybe even in one cloud because that's where I prefer. Or look, I'm using Workspace, but I need to be able to talk to data sitting in this cloud or whatever. Like, you're going to have anchor tech. You're not going to duplicate literally your chat system in every cloud. You're not going to duplicate your identity potentially. And so you might say, look, I'm making my big bet on Azure AD. Hey, can you federate with this? Can I make sure that I'm not duplicating and then exposing permissions and getting stale stuff? So cool. So yeah, we're really good about that. I think that's where open standards do play a big part here. I've seen, if you've noticed, we pioneered this and the other clouds have followed, but this idea of even treating your first party services as if they were Kubernetes resources. We have a config connector. It's a bunch of operators that says, hey, I can create a BigQuery table. I can create a pub subtopic, a VM, an identity role, all with a Kubernetes YAML manifest. Now, Azure copied that. Now they have like 30 to 50 services you can provision in Azure as operators. Amazon does the same. So what that means as a customer is I could say, I take this sort of Kubernetes resource model approach, and it doesn't matter which cloud I use, it looks kind of the same. And if I'm deploying an app that looks like A, B, and C, I can kind of stamp that out in every cloud more or less the same way. Now, still bring in Terraform, still use third-party tools for cost management. You're seeing a whole ecosystem pop up around this. Some of that feels opportunistic to me and maybe just like people trying to rebrand themselves to be relevant in the multi-cloud world. It's fine. Everyone will do their thing. But there is something around. I'm not sure the clouds are going to solve that directly as much as you'll see folks trying to say, hey, here's how I arbitrage between clouds, or here's how I make, hey, my single, Confluent Kafka messaging fabric work across all the clouds. So it doesn't matter where your workload is. I think that can be pretty powerful stuff. I like that. I think I'd almost rather leave it to smart people to kind of bring it together versus trying to make the cloud providers figure it all out. We'll see. But I like that there's a mix of both. We'll do standards, and then you'll see outside in maybe use some of those standards to create more portability.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that's, so I like the attitude. I really like the attitude that Google has towards this. And, when you compare it with other cloud providers, some cloud providers can be a little more stubborn in terms of accepting this reality. But Google's been really good about this. Now, I don't know if this is a cultural thing at Google or if it's because Google isn't, by all the measures, at least that I know of, Google is in a solid third place, and they're really aggressive going after both AWS and Azure. So I wonder if that attitude is coming from that aggressiveness, or if that's just how Google is across the board. I'd be super curious. You've been there for a while.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's going to be a bit of both. I mean, the market leader, that's why Amazon's probably been a little slow to come around on hybrid and multi-cloud, because you kind of have to admit that we're not going to be the final destination for everything. Who wants to say that when you're in first?
Yeah, and why should they? They don't have to.
No, of course. So completely understandable versus we've been upstart. Now, but when you look culturally, though, when you look at just look at the open source history, like we've shipped a lot of stuff that we didn't monetize till very much later. Even when it comes to Kubernetes or Android, or look at now things like Angular and Flutter, which dominate the front end. And arguably, we have no real monetization for those things. They just have kind of taken off, used all over the place. Istio, Knative, all of these things. I like seeing that TensorFlow. I'd love seeing Amazon write blog posts about TensorFlow. Makes me happy. A, because it's our tech, but B, because it simply means like, look, this stuff has become ubiquitous. And so I think we've been good, not just about open source, but open source standards. And the industry does not talk a lot about that. A lot of companies make open source. Who else is using it? Doesn't count the same to me. So if you've made an open source standard where now multiple clouds are using it, multiple software vendors are using it, that is a huge win for the customer. Just because I've open sourced my framework, if nobody else uses it, what has that really helped with my portability? I don't want to run that myself later. You're saying no other products use it. So I think there's value in open source standards, which we've been good at. So a lot of that is just DNA. Like we're just trying to make better infrastructure everywhere, but also I'm not naive. Our goal is to also draw gravity to not just the open APIs, but the best place to run them. And I'll easily say, like if you look at the Google tech, like TensorFlow is best on Google Cloud. GKE is far ahead of any other Kubernetes product. So we're really good at running our open source. That's hopefully going to be an advantage, but you don't have to run it here. And for the customer, that's the biggest win. is that I can still run this tech all over the place, and I might still have a preference to go not just to the source code, but the source of code, as Matt Acey says. But I think there's something to our DNA of just creating a lot of stuff that a lot of people can use, and we figure out how to make money on it later.
Yeah. Yeah, and Google's come a long way. Google Cloud in particular has come a long way. I mean, when I look back at Google Cloud in particular 5 years ago, it's funny, and that the idea of you build a lot of things and all of these things are DNA. Oftentimes when I used to talk to the Google Cloud folks, I'm like, hey, they would be like, well, we have this capability. They just have to code against it. I'm like, yes, but they're an enterprise. They can't code against it. You have to do it for them. So there was always that mentality of, what are you talking about? We have it. I'm like, you have it as in you're enabling people to have it, but you need to take it that extra step. But I can say that at least in the last 3 years, Google has done a fantastic job of closing the gap with the other cloud providers in bringing these capabilities that were potentially always there, but enabling them for what an enterprise would want to use them for. I think that's been a really, really interesting journey to see Google Cloud come all that way. But I'm curious now. So you talk to a lot of customers. What are the use cases or the industries that you see multi-cloud more popular in than others? Do you have that data by chance?
When you think of use case, we talked about before, whether it's things like DR, you're thinking actual workloads. What are you thinking about?
Well, no, but let's take it up a notch. Maybe which industries are using multi-cloud the most? Do you feel like, is it more the financials? Is it the retailers? Is it a mixed bag at this point?
I mean, I've seen a lot in financial services. Usually this is a big result of M&A as well. So if you're looking at industries where there's a lot of acquisition, you're multi-cloud whether you want to be or not. There's no way you only buy companies who use one cloud. Like, the odds of that are really slim. So you're really looking at those industries, which can be everything from, the energy sector. It can be anything from financial services and retail, especially now as you have more consolidation with a lot of companies. So that's been a big thing. Even the federal governments in different countries are still doing a lot in this space for a variety of reasons. Again, trying to spread risk or just, again, different relationships. So I don't think I've seen one completely dominant. I don't know any financial services firm I've talked to who's not multi-cloud. And again, sometimes that's organic. And it's just like, hey, this team used this cloud, this is that. I do see very few companies who've been purposely multi-cloud. Now that's changing. And more of my conversations in the last 12 months are with companies now creating a multi-cloud strategy because they've accidentally become multi-cloud. So the number of companies I've talked to, you're probably the same, who've said we started with a multi-cloud strategy. I can count on maybe 3 fingers. Like, that does not happen. You're always almost back into it.
Yeah. I think we're starting to see more and more. They're taking a strategic approach, but I agree with you. So far, most of it's been they've come across it one way or another. M&A is a huge thing. Shadow IT has been another one, but yeah, absolutely. That's been the case. Yeah.
And when I coach people on it, and again, I could be wildly off, but I try to focus on the 4 things that I think to me make up a decent multi-cloud strategy. At least you have to include them. One is a decent purpose, because if your team just thinks use whatever the heck you want, you're going to have a bit of chaos. And so good purposes are use the right best of breed tech, be right for the local sovereignty in the region. I think bad reasons are avoiding lock-in, because you do weird architectural, unholy things if you're just trying to prevent any sort of connection to the infrastructure. And I think actually resilience isn't a great reason, because again, you can over-architect trying to avoid downtime for 1 second in this cloud, you cut over here. So I think you need some purpose. I think for the first time, we talked about it here, you actually have cloud originating tech that can be part of your multi-cloud strategy. 5 years ago, this was a non-category.
That's
right? If you were doing multi-cloud, you had to start with software vendors and bring that to the cloud. Now you can say, hey, I can use Azure Arc or Anthos, or I can use a BigQuery Omni, or I can use other stuff that's born in the cloud. I think that's has to be at least a consideration in your strategy. And then you have, okay, what do I bring to the cloud though? So have I made a bet on HashiCorp Vault? And that is going to be my secret store in every cloud, and I'm going to bring that to my environment. Do I want to bring my hypervisor? I mean, long term, I don't know if that's really the strategy, but nonetheless, that still may be a bet I'm making as I go to cloud. So you kind of have your vendor in sort of software versus your cloud out software.
That's right.
And then finally, I think that one that sometimes we don't pay as much attention to is the architecture. And so am I architecting for data gravity? What am I doing for identity management? How am I thinking about cost optimization? Because it's really easy to all of a sudden start blowing out your budgets because you're duplicating things, transferring data, whatever. Are you training your people for this? Are you thinking in products and platform teams? Like those are things, like if you're not doing those 4 things, there's probably 9 others. I don't see how you have a great multi-cloud strategy. You're probably flailing a little bit. And it seemed to resonate. Folks realize I got to come at this from my software, my people, my training, my purpose. And if I connect that well, multi-cloud does not have to be tolerable. It can be an advantage. It can also be a completely albatross if you do it wrong. So it seems like folks are figuring that out, which makes this a pretty fun time to be an architect, a fun time to be a developer, maybe a fun time to be an ops person, but definitely a fun time for people like you and I to get to talk about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I've got one more interesting topic for you. We're gonna close on this last one. So one of my biggest challenges when I was an analyst and still today, and this is across the board, so this isn't specifically to Google, but this is across the board, is I was starting to get new feature or new service fatigue. Like every time there's a Google Next or a reInvent or an Ignite, and these cloud providers are rolling out all of these services, I was having a hard time keeping up with the services. All the services have different names. What does this do and what does that do? So I'm at a point now when I'm talking to cloud providers, I'm advising them to maybe, I don't want to say stop creating these services, but start focusing more on the solutions. So instead of giving me all of these services that I can put together, put together a solution and say, you know what, for imaging, this is the solution that you would need. And all of the services are already kind of pre-built so that I'm just gravitating towards the solution as opposed to trying to understand and learn all of these services and the branding that comes around them. Please tell me this is a conversation you guys are having internally.
Yeah, no, I get it. I'm paid to keep up with this and I barely do. And that's even just for my company, let alone all the clouds. There's there's a few things I think about when you say that. So first, I agree with you on the sort of integration piece. Now, at the same time, I've had a customer in the past tell me, don't tell me about solutions when you haven't heard my problem. So when you give me some hyper integrated set of things that solve a problem, how does that work in my architecture? Maybe I don't use that piece or that piece, but I get it as a framing. And so I think most cloud providers would do the industry a service by finishing more of their services and integrating more of them. I don't want to use 200 different dashboards in your cloud. I want it to feel like I'm using a bunch of integrated products. I want to make sure that when this thing happens, I'm not stitching everything together. Those two things should just work together. And we, Google Cloud, I think, spends pretty good time on integration and user experience. And some of that comes from our history. Like you and I never had to look for an advertisement for Gmail. We just wanted to use it and it was easy to use. And I don't remember ever reading training manual for that. Like this isn't the old Siebel days or like 12 days of training to use SharePoint. Like I just learned how to use Maps and Gmail and name it. And so some of that goes into our cloud mindset of just this stuff should be easy to use. This is our kind of consumer mindset going into cloud. But all the cloud providers need to be thinking about finishing more of their services, not just throwing out beta products and moving on.
Or staying in beta forever.
Staying in beta forever. Sometimes we can raise our hand on that. And then, integrating them better so that people, again, aren't just getting, as I think Corey Quinn has said, just kind of like dumping out the Lego bricks or just whatever. Like I'm just handing you a bunch of stuff and telling you to do stuff. So we got to integrate them better. But then, frankly, we also need a better job of repetition. Because I can't just announce a thing at this conference and then assume everybody knows about it and never talk about it again. Nope. I should probably have a regular drumbeat of like, hey, here's what's new in this thing. Hey, here's this product that, we launched before. There's nothing new. I just want to remind you of, hey, customer stories. How are they using it? What are the case studies? And we all get this shiny new object syndrome where I need the 100 announcements at reInvent or I need whatever versus just, hey, remind me again what I'm supposed to use among your 14 databases. Cool. Okay. I've got a use case. Let me figure this out. So, I think you all said this at a conference, or Gartner again said this at a conference. I was in Barcelona a couple of years ago, I guess 3 now. And it was the industry doesn't need more information. They need more context and confidence. I loved it.
I agree.
Because our whole industry is full of information. What I need is context about why it matters. And I need confidence that I can do it. And if more marketing teams, more product management teams, more DevRel teams, more of us took that mindset that we need to come in here and just make sense of what we've just thrown into this industry, we would be such a better group of people than just kind of blaring out the latest announcements.
I agree. I 100% agree with you. And that was my point is the announcements are important, but it's the packaging, it's the use cases, it's what I can do with it. Now, yes, you might not want to use what I have packaged, and you still have that option. We have all of these things, go for it, do whatever you want. But at least for those recurring themes, those recurring things, hey, if you're in, I don't know, if you're in the restaurant business, these are the types of integrated solutions that we typically see. You can use them, you can augment them, you can build it from scratch if you want, but channel the conversation a little more and elevate it more than just IaaS and PaaS, so to speak, and all of the different databases, all of the different capabilities, because you become numb. It's like, okay, so there's all of these things. Well, which one do I use? And it becomes interesting for sure when you're talking to customers.
No, I'm a big believer in the paradox of choice. And you and I can go to the cereal aisle at the grocery store and just get intimidated and just grab some Pop-Tarts and run out screaming because there's just too much. Like sometimes that's why I like going to In-N-Out. There's one choice, give me a burger.
Here you go, cheeseburger.
If I want to go to the Cheesecake Factory and see a 19-page menu, then that's something else I can do. But for most people, that stuff is paralyzing. Like it just freezes you. And the cloud can do the same thing. So we need to do a better job of sometimes putting you in a great lane that says, if you're just trying to solve this,
that's right.
Firebase is an amazing stack. Just use this for mobile. Kind of don't look at anything else. You're great. Or you're trying to build this. Here's a great architecture. And
that's
just kind of, simplify this stuff, demystify this stuff. The cloud services are amazing. You don't need all of them. You shouldn't be using all of them for each use case. Pick the stuff that's going to make the most difference for this use case. Play with the next thing the next time.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times when I was still at Gartner, one of the first questions that customers would ask me, "Hey, how do you keep up with all of these announcements and services?" And it was a fair question, but we were compartmentalized, right? So I focused on specifically one area and not everything, because it was impossible. It was very difficult. So yeah, that's interesting.
I still don't know how CIOs do it. I don't know how enterprise architects do it. I don't know how IT leaders, when they have a real day job and they're not just, especially if they're not flying and reading the airplane magazines anymore, how in the world are you keeping up with what's going on? I actually have no sincerely idea. I ask that from time to time in these meetings because I just genuinely want to know, because I don't know how I would do it. So not only are we pummeling stuff out from the cloud, but every open source product, all these commercial vendors who have picked up their pace, software vendors who are shipping more than once every 3 years, you are absolutely deluged with updates, new tech, new paradigms. Containers are old, serverless is in. What about WebAssembly? Oh my gosh, like I just went P2V, like I just went to virtual machines. How are you? I can't keep up with this. I actually don't know how folks are doing it. I think they're just picking and choosing some areas.
I agree. I don't think they are. I agree with you. They're not. Oftentimes it's what they know and they start to augment, or they pick up bits and pieces, or they start to learn about it because of a project that came up and they need to solve for that particular problem. But otherwise, it's very difficult.
Yeah, that's a tough gig. So it keeps us in business as we hopefully make a little more sense of all this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, man, the conversation with you is a lot of fun. There's probably a million other questions that I can ask. So we're going to have to get you back on the show really, really soon. Thank you so much for sharing some time with us and sharing all that information.
No, I hope you'll genuinely have me back. This stuff is fun to talk about, fun to do. I mean, this is the best doer culture of technology probably in my lifetime, because it's never been easier to do more stuff quickly. But again, you can do a lot of the wrong things now, and you can not have all the information. So yeah, having conversations like this, just kind of working through meaty topics, I think we need more of that stuff, not necessarily just 280 characters on Twitter.
I agree. And maybe next time we're going to bring you back to talk about the metaverse and talk about how many NFTs you've bought in the last month.
Web3 for the win.
Web3 for the win. That's right. Richard, thank you so much for making time today. I enjoyed this a lot, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks much. Take care.